Call to order the Zoning and Design Review Board meeting for Town of Yountville. It's February 9th, 2010. Have roll call. We have Member Wennerberg. Here. Member Dornbecker.
Here.
Member Halliday.
Here.
And Chair James is absent. And I have a motion to adopt the agenda.
I shall move. Second.
Okay. Agenda adopted. Approval of minutes for January 12th, 2010. Do I have a motion to adopt?
Motion to adopt.
Second. Okay. Minutes are adopted. Seeing no members of the public, I think we will not have a public comment period. And is there anything on the consent agenda? Doesn't look like it. And so should we move on to the annual update of the Yountville Forestation Plan?
Okay. Bill Primick was retained in 2007 and to produce an update of the Heritage Oak Tree Survey that was originally compiled in 1996. And in his 2007 report, he noted removals that had been, of tree removals, and there were some trees that had been missed in that earlier survey, and he was adding, and again, these were oaks at the time. The list was pretty much confined to oak trees, and so he was adding oaks that had not been included in the original survey, correcting locations of mislocated listed trees, assess conditions of the oak trees, and made recommendations for maintaining their condition in good health. And then subsequent to that, in 2009, an additional update was made, which is what has been presented to you in your packet, a copy of that. And that, again, to record losses of trees that had occurred in the 2-year period. Seemed like an unusually active 2-year period. As I remember, relative to other years, we had a number because of some development-related removals, and then some emergency removals that had occurred along the creek and elsewhere. It was also the time the discussion of the big grandfather oak occurred as well. And part of that was to expand the list of trees that went beyond just oaks and trees that he believed to represent a significant component of the urban forest that were not oaks, including redwoods and some cedars, olives, and there were a couple of other individual trees that he had listed. A total of 142 new trees were tagged, and among them the new species, and added to the list. Most of the trees he surveyed and added were in public parks and right-of-ways. He revised the recommended tree list that I included as an attachment, and those trees were selected in consideration of their compatibility with local conditions and environmental requirements for water consumption, space needs, clearance of overhead lines, this type of thing, depending on their use. And he was trying to come up with a list with this concept of the right plant, right location. And so that, and I think I have that's that little 3-page matrix that was included in your staff report. And I seem to don't have a copy of it. Now, one thing in looking at this report that I will, I guess a general comment of where we're headed with this update effort is the work he's produced here. Eventually, there's some more tasks to be done, and including accepting on the council's part this idea of an expanded list that goes beyond oaks and to include those other trees. But also, I'll comment on the format of how this is. If you look at the report, staff will be suggesting and talking with Bill about condensing this down to more of just information and maybe the extraneous methodology and conversations had with various people that are all included in here, and what he was tasked to do, and distilling it down to maybe more the conclusions that were reached in the report. And because we envision this report to be incorporated by reference, we want to consolidate. There's about at least four different tree ordinances right now found in the Muni Code and the Zoning Code. There's mention of one in the Design Ordinance, and then there's also mention, I think, elsewhere in the Muni Code and then there's a Heritage Tree Ordinance. And we want to kind of get it down into one coherent tree ordinance that spells out, talks about heritage trees, trees in general, what you have to go through process-wise for a tree removal, emergency removals, replacement of trees, this idea we've been promoting of in lieu fees rather than direct replacement if there's not room on the site. And so we'll build up a fund for off-site replacement rather than on the site if it's not possible. And then that's this whole idea of Bill identifying candidate sites that can receive new trees where that would make sense. What the formula is for and ratio for the dollar cost that will be owed to the town for removal of a tree. How we handle emergency removals. Now, in those cases, there's no permit issued. It's just because it's an emergency situation. Right now, the ordinance is set up that we can only recoup replacement trees when there's a permit involved, and there's no permit with emergency, but some of these trees are very significant. And then kind of more of a entire discussion related to responsibility of the trees and what's the town's role and what's the property owner's role, what's the property owner's responsibility when the tree is adjacent to their property but out in the public right-of-way. Are they entirely responsible for it? Is there some assistance available to the town, or is it the town's responsibility? This tree that fell down on Humboldt, it was kind of a liner. It was part, as near as I could determine, part on the property, the private property, a part out in the right-of-way. Luckily, there was no damage, but then it kind of gets into a whole liability thing. If there was damage and it fell on a car into a house, how that all, from, say, an insurance claim gets addressed. Would they be coming after the town? Because let's assume it were completely in the right-of-way and fell on a house. What would be, I'm sure the insurance company would be coming to the town for recompense. So those are the issues we see necessary to be addressed in the new ordinance, and this certainly provides a base for what we have in the way of heritage trees and some recommendations for his recommended list of new trees that are appropriate for street trees. Some of those, we also have this list of trees that are prohibited trees, and I would like to broach or at least examine that list, and in particular palm trees that are on that list, and present the idea for consideration, discussion that palm trees are present in the community in greater number than when you really start looking for them. They're kind of everywhere, and you can't go too far without not seeing one. And they add a certain texture to although they're not natives, yes, that's true, but they do add a variety and a certain contribution that's different from all natives, and certainly vary the palette and are appropriate in many cases to the architecture present in town, which is in some cases Victorian, and that was certainly one aspect of the Victorian era is they were into exotics and go out and collect one of everything, plant it in your yard, and palm trees were certainly along that line. So I think they're also a tree you find often on farmsteads where there's like this brace of oak trees at the entry and maybe some cedars behind it, kind of as an entry statement, because they are exotic looking. And to ban them outright and to say we can't plant any more palm trees at all, I don't know if that is the right tack to take. And in the other trees that are on the prohibited tree list have various faults and defects that you don't want. Like I think the list includes liquid amber that have the kind of spiny balls that get thrown everywhere, and maybe go through that list so that for good reason most of the trees are not on there, or they have roots that heave up sidewalks, driveways, and we don't want them planted. They drop litter or a fruit that we don't want. But I think going through that list, and one thing we're certainly going to be involved in too coming up is this, it's called WUCLs. It's a list of trees that are assessed on their water demand. Mm-hmm. And then there is another list. This ties into this WELO, this Water Efficiency Landscape Ordinance. And it's very formulaic, and you have to divide plants into low, medium, high water consumers, and you go to that WUCLs list for as the authority for which category they fall into, and then that low, medium, high gets plugged into a larger formula of, ideally each site is going to be on a formula allotted X amount of water. And you've got to design the landscape to not exceed that amount of water. And so that's where that's headed. There's, in part, another, forget who maintains this list, but it's a plant list of invasive species. And Santa Rosa has taken the very strict what they have out there is the state has suggested a model ordinance, and that invasive plant list figures into that. And you can go more stringent than the state model, and Santa Rosa has done that. And they have banned any tree or plant that's on the invasive species list. Now, we've got to be careful there because one of the trees is pistache, and we use that a lot here. Now, a plant can be invasive, and it doesn't mean it's going to just run rampant over the landscape. Some of them on there will. There's this tree of heaven and some of those that are like weed trees and will root anywhere. But there's others that are used as ornamental landscape, and because they're well adapted to the Mediterranean climate. So that will be another component of what we would be looking at to maybe prohibit trees, but we got to go slow on that and make sure that's what we want to do and not just wholesale adopt the whole list necessarily. So those are kind of the tasks in front of us. We're going to be consolidating the ordinances that we already have, including the Heritage Tree Ordinance, and using Bill's work to update that as part of that. And Bill's work will also, the recommended tree list and the formula for determining replacement trees and when we go for the in lieu fees and what that dollar amount will be converted into from the trees that's removed. And so that list of tasks, or this list 1 through 6 in the staff report here. And right now, tonight, what we're, I suppose, after is any comments you might have on what has been completed in his report. A lot of it, he recounts the 2007 work that's already been done, and then the 2009 update that the significant thing was the addition of non-oak species and expanding the urban forest list to incorporate those. Now, those trees will have the same protection that the heritage trees have, and that means like the redwoods, and he's very specific. He identifies where they are, the redwoods in Yountville Park. There's some deodar cedars in the cemetery. There's some olive trees that he's identified their location. So those will come under the heritage tree protections. And we'll be adding sections for defining this, like I say, the landowner's role and the town's role and responsibility, and the formula for determining in lieu fees. If there's any questions I can answer, I'd be happy to.
Allow me to apologize for my tardiness. The joys attendant to having a family are many, but not without their frustrations as well.
And where this will go from here is that we're going to, this is a work in progress. Like I said, it's not the final, other than the update as you find it here, and any comments you wish to make on it. But we'll be taking this presentation to the council, and as a presentation, no action, just information for them, and any comments you would have, we could include those. I don't know that we would include them in the council's presentation, but more at a time when, if you have any impressions or notions that you want to pass along, and we will come back at a later time when we bring all of this together and consolidate these ordinances and the new components of the formula and emergency and the responsibility areas. We'll present that, and that'll be another separate discussion at that time.
I have a question. Can you give me an example of how specific the responsibility for trees on one's property, what kind of language, specific language you will be using for that?
Well, there's a lot of, I don't really have it all thought out yet, because fundamentally we've got to have the discussion of who's responsible, and is it the property owner responsible for a tree that's out in the public right-of-way, that's a heritage tree, and it needs maintenance, and we're going to write him a letter and say, hey, by the way, you're lucky enough to have this big tree in front of your property, and it needs X, as determined some care, pruning or whatever. And they would be on the hook for that, or would be a town responsibility to take that on. So I don't know that. I think that foundation, bedrock, philosophical decision has to be made as to who would be responsible for these trees. It can get into quite a bit of money, and the trees that we've had until Bill arrived on the scene, it was kind of a policy of benign neglect. They were just out there, we enjoyed them, but there wasn't much being done to them, even the town trees. Now we are taking a more proactive role to where he mentions like exposing the root flare and getting rid of the buildup around trunks and pruning and some other measures that actively need to be taken to maintain the health of the trees. And that could come down to telling someone who has a heritage tree on there, maybe it's all the way on their property, that, hey, your tree needs X, Y, Z. And it could be an expense right out of the blue for anyone that wasn't expecting it. So that's part of the discussion of what's equitable, what's fair, and still maintain the forest. And if I'm open to suggestions, if anyone has any
I had a question about the recommended tree list. The arborist in his report mentions at some point that he went through the list and added a couple trees here and there and had recommendations for trees that maybe shouldn't be on the list. The list that we have right now, does that reflect his changes or recommendations, or?
The little spreadsheet?
Yeah.
3 pages? Yes, and that, there's been some comment made already by others in the community, in particular Lori Cagwin, and there's, I can't think of the rest of her name, sorry. Carrie, yes. And she's landscape architect and made some suggestions and that he incorporated. And there was a first take at this list that was a little bit different, and he dropped a couple of trees because of comments she made. One in particular, I think, is a hawthorn that when it's in bloom, it gives off kind of a noxious odor that attracts flies and whatever, bees or something. And, so the list you see there is distilled down a little bit from an original list.
Okay.
And is palm going to be added to this list?
Well, that's kind of my private cause. I think they lend an element to the community that and a variety that's worthy of not banning them outright, and I'm just putting that out there for consideration.
Well, does this list automatically mean that anything that is not on this list is banned?
No, there's another list, and I'll run and get it in a second, and I can read it to you. It's short, but it's a list that was adopted in an ordinance some years ago of prohibited trees, and palm is one of them. Now, I'm not saying all the other trees on there don't have a defect that they shouldn't be on there. Maybe most of them should be on there for various reasons, of like invasive roots and whatever. But I think palm trees, probably the defect about them is, one, they're not native, and maybe that was the thinking at the time. They're not native, bad, and they do require some maintenance. You got to climb up there every now and then, and the thatch has to be removed, or they can fall. The fronds, the dead ones, I guess, fall out of the tree, and it's a hazard. And some of them produce fruit, and that dates that will drop.
Is that the metric? Because on the prohibited list it says palm and then parenthetically most species, but it fails to identify which species.
Yeah.
Is it the fruiting, which, because I believe it talks about fruiting olive trees, and then black walnuts are on the list, and those are very messy. So, but that metric's never been defined.
No, it hasn't. That's a good point. And if someone wanted to come in and plant a palm, I would be at a loss to know whether that's a good or bad one.
And I'm going to say up front, I'm not a botanist or an arborist, so I don't know, but how are they with water?
Palms?
Yeah.
Well, the ones that I'm aware of require zero irrigation, and we get some weed palms, actually. They seem to have a nasty habit of taking root right next to a phone pole. And, I mean, there's one right out here by the school that we actually removed. There was one right down by the post office that was removed right next to a pole where they put the oak in there. It was next to a post, that corner post of the porch cover on the post office that was removed when they put the oak in and moved it there. But they always like to get right next to something, it seems like, and take root. And they seem to require no irrigation.
Bob, 2 questions. What is the proposed new standard for replanting? I read there's a discussion of introducing an in lieu of fee, and to a certain extent I could support that, whereby if a tree is removed and there's not adequate space for the replanting, say for example 1 tree is removed and whatever formula is used requires 6 trees to be planted in its stead,
Right.
And there's simply not room on that frontage for 6 trees. So an in lieu of fee where then town staff can go locate 5 other places for new trees.
Yeah.
But what is the proposed standard?
Well, I think Bill has been working, and we've had a discussion with him on that, and we're not, that's part of what the work to be done yet is, but I think where we're headed with it is it would be a similar to the way we assess it now, like on an inch basis of the diameter of the tree that's removed, and that we would want, I think, what is it, an inch and a, for every inch and a half, it's a new tree required.
Inch by inch for replacement.
Inch by inch?
Using either a 15-gallon or 22.
Yeah, and then it comes down to what the replacement tree, what the cost of it would be, a 15-gallon or 24-inch box. And we want to, and it would include labor cost of purchase of the tree and labor cost to install. So I think we are right now, we're looking at a per tree replacement cost of somewhere around $350. Was that the last one?
Inch and a half caliber, and that's a 22-inch box.
Yeah. And, I mean, you can get it down to where you go buy in a little pot,
No,
oak,
no.
and you're not going to build a fund up. What they're not buying the tree and giving it to us, they are paying us the equivalent to go buy that tree.
Right.
And what it would cost to have someone plant it. So, in order to build a fund up, we would be looking at a per tree of about $350 that they would be assessed depending on the size that's removed.
I understand. So the number of trees is tied to the size of the existing tree. In other jurisdictions, I know Calistoga uses simply a 3-to-1 ratio. Napa it's 1 tree, and then for every 6 inches of DBH after, I think, the first 12, it's another tree. But a similar metric. Do you see at least one of these replacement trees being planted where the removed tree is taken out, and then the town undertakes the responsibility, collects the money, and actually goes out and plants the trees?
Yeah, and that's a case-by-case assessment. And there was a tree removal permit. The last one was an oak. That's a heritage oak behind on Jefferson, near Bordeaux House, just behind the north fence or north of their boundary there. That kind of arts and crafts house, a very attractive house with a detached garage, and the second unit over it, it was behind the garage. You couldn't even see it from Jefferson. You had to kind of go down the side to really see the tree, but it was an oak tree that was leaning, and they were building a fence through there, and they requested removal and went to council meeting ago. And it really wasn't even an appropriate place because the patio was right there too. There wasn't anywhere on site to plant any new tree that would have been appropriate. And we're getting back to this concept Bill wants to follow of the right tree, right location, and that includes space to grow. And one, I don't know, I'm more observation I frequently make on new developments is how they look great when they're new, but it's a new development. They'll stick a tree right against the building, and then they fill out later, and they're shearing off the form of against the building, so it can still be there. You see it going into Napa. There's an retirement community or senior housing apartments off to the right, and they planted some firs, and some are away from and have a nice form, and some of them were right against the building. And that's a common thing that happens, and that's not right tree, right place. We can do that and shove them against buildings initially, but eventually they're going to be a problem, and that's what we're trying to avoid. Well,
Your point's
we
well.
had one over in Burgundy Commons too, a couple.
Your point's well taken. I could rephrase the question to say, I would want the ordinance to not make it simple just to say, well, we'll get rid of the tree and let the town plant all the replacement trees. That if there's an appropriate space on site, even if it's not the identical one for the good reasons you gave, that the first place any replanting occurs is on the site. and only after that's been eliminated.
I totally agree.
So I could have phrased the question better.
And part of the, if I can just follow up
Please do.
one thought of when we do, let's say we're owed 3 trees or whatever, and there's only place for one, and they pay us in lieu for the other 2. Part of our issue, too, that we've discussed with Bill is when you really look around town and at candidate receiver sites, so where are we going to, we could accumulate a lot of money to plant trees, but not have, I mean, some people assume it's a vast space out there to plant unlimited trees. Well, it's not. When you start taking into consideration, you don't want to run afoul of neighbors blocking views with new trees that they're not accustomed to, that are put in parks. And
That takes me to my follow-up question, which is 2 parts. The first is that I know that was a preliminary estimate, but I think $300 is awfully thin. I think it's going to be several times that to actually purchase a 24-inch box tree, particularly if it's procured by the town, to purchase that tree, have it delivered, have it excavated, have it planted. I think it's going to be, particularly if you're talking, as I say, a larger tree. The next part is any discussions for a funding mechanism for monitoring of the heritage trees. In your remarks when I first came in, you talked about how heretofore it's largely been benign neglect. And it's a difficult question about monitoring trees on private property. It seems to me there should be some sort of funding mechanism without necessarily creating a burden on the property owners where the town is accumulating money to every other year do a status report on the heritage trees. And it seems to me that this in lieu of fee, where there simply aren't places to plant trees, could be a good component of that. That, you know, we've accumulated X $10,000 in lieu of fees, and there's just no place to put trees, but we can put that money towards preserving the trees we have. And philosophically, that seems good to me.
Me too.
yes,
And I would want that in lieu of fee to not be punitive, but to be a disincentive. I think we've seen that not in Yountville, but with affordable housing. When the in lieu of fee, when it's cheaper to simply pay an in lieu of fee, any rational developer or any rational agent will pay the in lieu of fee when that's less expensive than actually building the units. And I think the same thing is true here. If it's simply easier to write a check than try to plant or preserve the trees. So again, not punitive, but onerous enough that there's a reasonable incentive to preserve or plant the trees.
And I don't know that we described the in lieu fee properly. We were saying there will be an inch-by-inch replacement, so we're talking a 10-inch tree means 10 inches replacement at the rate of a 24-inch box, which is an 1.5-inch caliber. And that's generally $300, so it's however many 22-inch box at an 1.5-inch caliber needed to make that replacement. So we're talking a few $1,000s rather than just a couple hundred.
I think I understand. In that example, it's, you know, might be 6 trees. And that I did grasp. I'm not sure that commonly $300 will cover the purchase of, say, this 1.5-inch, 24-inch box tree, to purchase it, deliver it, and plant it. Or it may be very close to the actual cost. I mean, I know I did several recently, and I could probably look it up and not make a liar of myself, and it was less expensive than I thought. But it ties into my comment about, well, not making it punitive, making the in lieu of fee an incentive rather than an easy way out.
Or disincentive.
Yes, well put, thank you.
Well, you already said.
The 2 comments, and then I'll clam up. I am adamantly opposed to coast redwoods being considered heritage trees. They're lovely trees in their environment. It's my opinion that their environment is not the valley floor. They're not I don't think they're native to the valley floor. I think redwood trees grow on hillsides and they grow in groups and they support one another. I think in lowland locations like this, they're really just weeds. They're destructive and messy. And while they're, I guess, an iconic tree in Northern California, I don't like them.
I think what the inclusion of the redwoods that he's identified were specific trees that were in Yountville Park.
It wouldn't hurt my feelings if one of those trees were suffering to see it replaced with something else altogether. I think they're weeds. I think they're planted because they grow quickly, and then they don't survive well in a lowland location. I do understand that he identified them specifically. It's sort of an axe to grind I have. I love redwood trees in the forest, but I don't like them as ornamentals.
And there's other individual significant redwoods. There's one right on Don Hensling's corner house across the street that its form kind of gets destroyed a little by PG&E. They scoop out the west side of it for the wires, and when that's undergrounded, it will come back to its form. But it's a tree that exists, and as you come down Washington, you actually see the top of that tree. It's sort of like right at your horizon point in the distance, coming after you turn off of California and coming into town. And I tend to notice these trees of where they are contributing other than just standing there in front of them. They're trees you see off in the distance and contribute to the entire feel of the urban forest, I suppose. And I think what he's suggesting is that there's individual trees that, and maybe you don't even want the ones in the park recognized for that status, and that's fine. We'll note that comment, and there may be others that feel the same. I don't know.
May I ask a question? If the coast redwood were to be put on a banned list, and in a development like the Vintage development, they used coast redwoods as sort of a boundary line in their, standing in a line, and would those homeowners be required to take those out?
No, I don't think we're suggesting an aggressive, if it's a listed tree, we go after it kind of a deal. It's just that it would have implications for planting new ones.
New ones.
And they wouldn't receive, in this case, special protection
I see.
as a heritage tree.
And they would be prohibited only where they are in or overhanging the right-of-way. So if
Okay.
someone wanted to plant it in their private backyard, they would still be
I see.
It's going to be hard for a full-grown redwood tree not to be in public right-of-way eventually.
And like Norfolk Island pines, have you ever seen those? They just have massive, they're pretty trees, but they just, I don't know how big they get across, 100 feet or something.
My last two, I hope, remarks are with respect to the heritage trees on private property. I'm very leery of any policy that turns into some sort of assessment to people who have these trees. At the same time, I would, and I don't have any good ideas, but something that provides an incentive for the owners of such trees to maintain them. I don't know what form that incentive could take. I don't want to see something, a parcel tax or any assessment for their maintenance, because the town, I think, identifies these trees as a benefit to the community, so I think the town has a responsibility to be involved in their maintenance. We can certainly discourage destructive behavior towards them. But I would like to see something, a carrot end as well. Again, I don't have any good ideas on what you can offer a private property owner, whether it's recognition, assistance in the upkeep. We do have language in the ordinance now that talks about when there's financial hardship, the town can help, but that's left ill-defined. So I hope I formulated maybe the problem, but I don't have an idea for a solution. And then lastly, on Mr. Pramick's proposed list, I would like to see a greater emphasis on native species. If I could operate by fiat, I would make Coast live oaks be the street tree in town. So, thanks for your patience.
So would you say native for
The valley.
for the valley and as use as a street tree?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Jason, what did you say?
I said if I could decide by fiat, Coast live oaks would be the street tree in Yountville, just because I really like them.
Oh, okay.
But broadly, I would like the list to be more heavily emphasize native species.
Well, I guess I'll jump in. Just to go off of Jason's comments about redwoods, I'm supportive of identifying the iconic ones and having those on the list. Personally, I'd like to see redwoods on the banned list for landscaping. I think they're misunderstood. A well-maintained redwood in a backyard, in someone's backyard, in very short order can outgrow the site, outshade the neighbors, and block views. So I'm opposed to having them in the small landscaped areas, in residential landscapes, to be more clear. I don't know exactly where it fits in, but some discussion of trees and/or heritage trees and the interface between those trees and view corridors. We live right on the edge of a view corridor, the little public path that goes east towards the Baca Range, and so we can't plant any trees in our side yard, and the town doesn't plant any trees along that little trail. So, but there is a palm that found itself on the town's property, on the trail itself, and it gets chopped down every couple of years, but it's going to block the view eventually, and it helps make our yard a little bit more private. But that's just something maybe to consider.
The consideration would be maintaining the view corridor, or?
Well, yeah, and I guess I'm just looking to open up that discussion. Is how do trees and maybe a tree that someday will become a heritage tree, how does that all fit in with the view corridors and how we manage those corridors? And so I think as Yountville has become built out, and I think some views have been lost in the past couple of years, I think we need to be a little bit more sensitive to how landscaping further impacts those views. And so I'm just throwing that out there. With the in lieu fees, I think I'm just supportive of that concept. I think the formula needs to account for the replacement trees, and I think using circumference as a factor is good. I like that. But I think besides just the tree, you're looking at the staking materials, as Jason mentioned, the labor to put that tree in, and if it's appropriate, I think we need to account for staff time that it takes to find where those trees are going to go. I don't see there will be situations where we have a site in mind and sure, yeah, we'll put a tree over there, but there's going to be times when we might be hard-pressed to find a useful site, and it's going to take some time to find a good site. A couple more comments. When it comes to keeping tabs on tree health, and I'm not sure how frequently we check in, but I think this is an opportunity for the town to use a technology that it's become widespread in vineyard use. It's called NDVI, and it basically measures canopy vigor from an airplane, and it's something that the town could do from, I don't know what the frequency would be, every couple years. And it might end up being more cost effective than having someone on the ground. although I know that needs to happen at a certain frequency as well. But this is something that you can use it as a non-invasive way to check in on heritage trees that are on private property and so forth.
Is that a infrared figure measurement?
It's a derivation of infrared. So it stands for Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, and it's color coded. Yeah, of course. I thought you might know that already. And there's a couple local firms that do that, so it's easily attainable around here. My last comment is regarding the recommended tree list. I like a lot of the trees on here. Like Board Member Janes, I'd like to see more natives. I think there's going to be slim pickings if we focus on just valley natives, although I think that's kind of the gold standard. I'd be happy with California natives that share so much similar habitats and climate types as ours. And again, it's not well quantified here in the tree list, but something, a comment better with long-term irrigation. I question how useful those trees are going to be. We don't know how much irrigation we're talking about here, and as we're talking about, going back and using trees or plants that require less irrigation, I'd like to see some more. I'd like to see that quantified more clearly. Let's see. Oh, and then the last thing about this list is, I think it would be more useful if it could be broken into where these trees belong. I think some of these trees are well suited as street trees. Others definitely aren't, and others wouldn't do well in a confined space along a curb or a roadside, or where the soil compaction is likely to occur. And so to break it into street trees, landscape trees, trees for parks or use in turf areas, I think would be useful for us and the general public.
Thank you. Before we move on, I remembered while you were talking just two things that I didn't mention. One of them is this idea that we tend to set a size, minimal size, and then if the tree is of that size, then we consider it a tree. It qualifies for a bona fide tree, and then it takes on protections of needing a removal permit if you're going to cut it down. And we were discussing with Bill the idea of, well, all big trees were little trees at one point, and if we just allow the wholesale removal of all small trees, then it has an implication for succession, and we maybe ought to have a class, probably, well, off the top of my head, native oaks in particular, that we would, no matter how big they are, we would have to assess whether they were in a position where we're just going to allow them to be wiped out, or that we want those trees to remain there in a good site. They're well adapted, they're not impacting anything around them, and that would be a good site for them to grow into be a big tree. And that whole thought of, that's something we'd like to throw out there, and if anyone has any thoughts. And the other one is, I remembered that one area we were talking about receiving these trees in particular would be maybe Hopper Creek, and that's already kind of a vegetated corridor that people are accustomed to having trees along there, and it plays right into Fish and Game's standards for creek protections and habitat of the riparian corridor and shading the water and that type of thing, that we would no doubt have to get permits to plant trees in the creek, but we'd probably be able to do that. And that's a nice long swath through town that could take trees.
I'll keep it short because I agree with most of what's been said. I have to fall on the sides of saying that I'd like to see the redwoods that are established now and are kind of iconic to get the heritage title, though I definitely agree, and I hate to say it because I'm from real Northern California where we love our redwood trees on the coast, but I definitely think this is an inappropriate place to be planting redwood trees. So I'd be for it being on the banned list as well. I just think it's, as my comment before, I think it's unrealistic to think that it's ever not going to affect everybody in the surrounding area. So I think it's important that those are planted in wonderful places, but where they're supposed to be. In lieu of fee, I totally agree with everything. I think I like the idea of some sort of fund that might not go directly towards planting new trees, but might also go towards taking care of the trees that we have. I know it's come up several times with in the council here as well about, what do we do with these trees? We have this grandfather oak tree, and it's going to take $75,000 worth of care or whatever it happens to be, and there's no real funding source for that. I think it's important to consider that as well. That being said, I know we're also in this reduction of carbon emissions, but we always talk about reducing carbon emissions, and trees do this. So if we can look beyond our borders too, I think that's important as well. I understand we talk about infill a lot of the time, but with view corridors, with property, with the trees that we have, sometimes planting a bunch more of these giant oak trees isn't really feasible. And I think it's important to know that while we have jurisdiction over what's in our immediate environment, we can still influence and contribute to the county as a whole. I'd like some thought put into that trees in the county wide would be help us all too as far as carbon emissions go. And then I want to really just stress the point that I really like the idea of getting this digitized. Even in this report, you notice that some either disappeared or got cut down, or we don't know where they are, or maybe they weren't categorized the first time well enough. I'd really like that. We can GPS map them. It'll make future iterations of this report, I think, a lot cleaner. And so I'd really, as I'm mapping our art walk through town, I was thinking about the same thing. It'd be wonderful if we could map these heritage oaks, if people could know where they are, see where they're at, and estimates of, wow, that tree's 200 years old. What was going on 200 years ago? I think it could be a great educational tool as well. So I hope that that's in there for future use. That's all I got.
I have one final comment, and that is that on the replacement trees that are designated, when you designate to put them in, I would hope that there would be some structure as to having neighborhood input into where these trees might be located, as for example in Vineyard Park, which is a view corridor. So I would hope that there would be some way for the neighbors who will be impacted to have some say in where these, especially if they're, large oak trees going in. That's all.
And finally, I agree with everything that's been said. Rather than ban trees, I would like to see that community of disfavored trees be allowed to go through a process before they're just automatically banned. If somebody really wants to plant a dreadful tree, they should have a hearing.
Redwood trees aren't dreadful, just maybe not appropriate.
I was thinking, I didn't even like to say it, eucalyptus.
Oh, okay.
No, but these things change. When my kids were little, once a year they each got 10 redwood trees and were told to take them home and plant them. And some of those trees lived and made our lives miserable. They belong in the forest. Yeah, Mulberry Street had 25 years of the trees with the little hand grenades. What are they called? You mentioned them.
Those spiny
And they formed a canopy and they turned color in the fall.
sycamore?
Liquid amber.
No,
Liquid
They were
amber,
just
isn't it?
liquid
gorgeous.
amber.
And they were replaced by crepe myrtle and pistache trees, which are now in disfavor. So these things evolve. I would like to see a lot of flexibility built in to a reasonable means of controlling our environment.
And I'm sorry, one thing I forgot to mention is I really think it's important that we look at the water issue
Yes.
very strongly. I think it's just only going to become more of an issue. I think it's important that when we're looking at these favorable trees, unfavorable trees, that's strongly taken into account. I think it lends itself to more of the natives and such, but just want that to be.
Yeah, that's kind of, the water issue will kind of get built into the whole, although I will say that this water efficiency landscape ordinance doesn't really get triggered. You got to do a lot to invoke it. And someone just wanting to put a plant in their yard, that's not going to be over the line. So, and, and that's kind of an interesting point there too of people just do stuff, and they're not coming here saying, hey, I've got a juniper I want to put in my backyard. It just is done. And so the amount of oversight is, it's not total by any stretch of the imagination. People are planning things all the time, and it's something that people that are into gardening are doing a lot of. They're moving plants around and buying new ones and getting rid of those, and so it's going on to some extent unnoticed by and unregulated and policed by the town, and it's almost, with the given staff, I couldn't imagine being aware of every redo of a yard that's happening.
And I definitely fall on the side of community development, education, and not policing. I don't think that should be our job. I think it should be much more aspirational. This is what we'd like to have.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there should be an expectation of us going through people's backyards and saying, looks like you dug that up recently.
Yeah, that's a good point. The WELO has a big kind of education component to it of what are good practices and what are not. Okay, that's all we have.
Well, no public hearing. Move on to no review and comments. So staff and board reports.
I think we have any. I'm thinking of what would be coming your way on the horizon. To heads up, you can't think of anything that really right now. We were going to talk about the sign though a little bit, and just at Sorrento, they've come back in with their that will be going at some point coming back to you. Because they're changing the mural.
The mural will be coming back. So
Yeah.
we were going to do a 10-day notice for the sign on the north elevation. They're wanting to change that one. And actually, they're wanting to change the one on the east elevation, too, but we feel that one's consistent with their approval enough. They have the 10 letters that are offset from the building, and they want to backlight those with LEDs and use a wing of metal to somehow hide the lights and everything. On the front, that seemed really consistent, so we approved that. It's on the north side that they want to do the same element, and that is instead of the painted 10 sign that had the antique feel, and that's because they're changing the mural, and that'll be coming back to you soon. And so we're going to do a 10-day notice on that north side.
And that sign is smaller than what they had presented, if I'm not mistaken, and I believe the mural is going to be smaller as well and more monochromatic and not, they were going to have almost like comic book colors popping out, you know, and they're going to subdue it more, if I understand what their direction is.
And they took your recommendation and, I guess, advice to them that they do more of a landscape scene versus something bold. So that's what you'll see.
Let's see what else is. Since last time did I mention we had done a 10-day, I think I emailed that to you, notice on I think it got mentioned too, it was a patio cover over on Landy. It's in Arden Mount and Landy Forster. It's Forster. It's a house that's sold recently at the north, or I guess it'd be southeast corner of Mount and Forster, where it intersects. It's a gray house, and they have a big backyard, and they want to have a patio cover off over their patio, and on the backyard they have a huge lot actually as they go in Washington Park. It's kind of an extra big lot. They want to actually remove a 6-foot fence that runs along the north side and replace it with a 3-foot stone wall, because they want to be able to look out from the yard. And what they'd be looking at, I was curious, well, what are they looking at, you know? And it's that little cottage cluster of 5 cottages over there. Mm-hmm. It's sort of the north end of that is what they'd be looking at, as near as I can tell. So that was and that would pass its 10-day, and if you see construction out that way, that's what's going on out there. I have a question on the art walk, or the art at where the oak tree is at the spa by Bellagio.
Yeah.
That's one of the sites apparently where they're going to have one of these big. Huther is his name.
Yeah, Gordon Huther.
Yes.
Gordon Huther.
And apparently this is a very massive, and they're going to put a pad on a little knoll that's on the north side of that, north of the oak tree, and then this thing is going to go on top of it. How did those sites come to be selected? If you know
Quite
that.
frankly, I think that's a question for Steve.
Steve was okay, probably
Yeah.
in conjunction with Judith.
Because actually, that piece was kind of pre my getting involved, and it seemed kind of separate from the subcommittee that they directly talked to Gordon Huther about specific sites in town, and some of them are directly integrated with what we've developed, the little park between Bartisono and the community center, places like that. And that was just a site. So I don't know exactly how it came to fruition that way.
Well, I certainly agree with the idea they need to be visible, because that's the whole idea, is to enjoy them, and the only one on that one is to have it raised.
Yeah, it's going to be big.
Yeah, to begin with, it's going to be raised, and then this, I guess, the piece itself, I don't know, I haven't seen it, but I understand it's pretty tall.
Yeah. Yeah, does that come through us at some point?
No, I guess not.
I mean, that's kind of a question. It seems like, especially some of these pieces are, I'm on two sides here, but some of these pieces are very large. I feel like they're potentially going to impact. So I don't know. I think this is more for guidance from what people here think about that. I mean,
What's the enabling legislation
Yeah.
for the art program? Does it exempt the pieces from design review because they're of transitory nature?
Well, I'd have to check this, but I think Steve went on to council and received the acceptance of the idea of it, and what specifics were provided as far as the sites, I'm not sure. and whether that was at the committee's discretion of where these were put, I don't know that, but I think that's how it came to be. And again, the idea behind it is to have these pieces visible to where they are, you hide them away and then have an art walk. It's that they're in visible, prominent locations so they can be enjoyed. And
Well, I have a question about that. If they have to make a pad, is that a cement pad for it to stand on? Is that temporary?
well, we're getting building permits for them, and part of just the practical concern are these are art pieces, but they're also just big pieces that are dangerous in the sense that if they were kids climbing on them, or if they were to topple over for some reason, so we're having them anchored down in the slabs. We're having anchor points to where they can secure the piece to the slab. And that's the practical consideration of safety.
And once that piece is removed, is the slab also removed?
I think the idea, if I understand correctly, is that it's going to be this rotating, that there'll always be some art on view there of whatever size. They could be big or small, but that's where they'll be.
That sort of sounds like something that we should be talking about here. I don't know, to me. It's my view.
Yeah, I did, and I brought up the question, maybe opening Pandora's box a little bit about it. I mean, I don't think, definitely as zoning, it doesn't feel like we should be evaluating the art, because quite frankly, the art's going to be subjective. But yeah, the pads and site development, which is just going to complicate matters. But I don't want them to be put somewhere and have community outcry about something, and then I don't know if there's something, set in stone yet.
I think very well put. I mean, I could, very well put. I could see the design review being, there's a 6 foot by 4 foot piece of art in this location, and leave the aesthetic judgment. I know I'm not qualified to do that, but it's, I think, well put by.
Unfortunately, Steve he's
here, so
been
we can
the moving force as far as staff, the staff contact on this, and I couldn't really converse about the site selection of all these pieces, or even how many there are total with you. But I can find that out, and then whether it was accepted by council and that was the level of review that it gets. Don't know that, and Steve is gone for another week and a half or so.
Nice.
So I couldn't get you any information. He's in Ethiopia and Kenya. I don't know if everybody knew that, but
No.
he's on taking a nice long vacation to an exotic part of the world.
He's looking for art.
And so this might come down to also difference between public property and private property. What the city's developing versus what community members are developing in coordination with the city.
All I could tell you there is that it's a mix of, we have one going on that little pedestal in the park next to Bardesano in the community hall that's just begging for something to be mounted on it, and that's going to be one of the places they're going to have a piece.
I thought that was going to be a sundial.
That was the original idea, that it was going to be, the concept of the park would be, and it's kind of been done to death, the cycles of the wine growing, and I think you get a lot of that elsewhere, but it was going to be a whole park designed it, and I think it's a tendency of maybe landscape architects outside of Napa Valley to immediately go to that, where let's develop something about the wine industry and the how the wine happens.
Taking cold
through
in
the year.
Newcastle, as it were.
Well, that was the sundial idea, and there were vines in there and other informational stuff about the cycles of the vine through the year and what happens, and the sundial figured into that, and just the piece itself was super expensive, and we were doing the park on limited
Okay.
resources.
So these art pieces will rotate, they'll be...
That's my understanding.
That's the goal.
Art is controversial, and I think we need to be open to the fact that some people are going to love them, some people are going to hate them.
And there's some cities that it's important enough to them that part of the development fee is for art, for public art, and, for the purchase of it.
Well, I have no quarrel with public art and an art walk and, the pieces coming and going, but if we're going to be putting cement pads near heritage trees, then I'm
Well,
concerned.
That was the question I had, and it was confirmed it's not near the tree. It's
Okay.
I only mentioned the tree as a reference point.
I see.
It's not crowding the tree. It's not in the drip line of the tree. It's
Okay.
kind of north of that tree, but on a knoll, a grassy knoll.
Well, we'll see.
Well, do I have a motion to adjourn and send Marita off to her birthday dinner?
I so move.
Second.
Thank you. By acclamation.